It's going to answer any question you got. Who knows?
I don't know about all that. I don't want to be video.
They told me to.
So, I have the right to.
I guess you're telling me not to. I don't know.
No, I'm not. They just told me to too, and I'm certainly not at my desk. So
Yeah,
Do you mind? Do you mind if I just follow what they told me to do, and you can tell them to delete it, since you have more authority than I do?
Okay.
Cool enough.
I really don't mind. I mean, but I'm not. I'm sweating like a pig from walking 6 miles today. So, I'd like to start kind of where he ended, and that's the idea of the applicability of a variety of progressive arguments in Lincoln Douglas. I think pretty much any argument can be applied to any format. It is all about the packaging of the argument. If you choose to engage in more progressive arguments that have the labels, for example, counterplans, as one example, and you're like, the text of the counterplan, and it's mutually exclusive, and it's, net beneficial, and you're going to lose a bunch of people who are not familiar with debate vernacular. But my thought is a lot of these arguments, and she asked me to talk a little bit about progressive arguments in Lincoln Douglas, and I'm going to let you really ask any questions that you want to ask, and we can work from there. But I thought he made a really good point that it's all about packaging. I would also suggest to you that a lot of the arguments that we now think of as progressive have been made forever, but they were made in a different way. Here's an example. One of the topics that has been debated a number of times in Lincoln Douglas is resolved that violence is a just response to political oppression. Resolved that violence is a just response to political oppression. Some would argue particularly timely now. But it seems reasonable for me, for the negative, to stand up and say, I agree that political oppression is a problem. I agree that we have a state that seems to have overstepped its bounds as it relates to its relationship with the individual. I fundamentally disagree with the method of the affirmative. I think that violence is a wrong response. I think, however, we should use nonviolence as our political response to oppression. Here's a reason historically nonviolence has worked. And to use Dr. King and to use Gandhi, right? And then say, here's a reason uniquely that violence intensifies political oppression. Violence makes the state, kind of come together, if you will, to fight back people who want to uprise in an aggressive or violent way. Is that a reasonable response, you think, from the negative, that they're allowed to just say that? And you're like, yeah, of course it is. Here's what I just said. Counterplan, don't do violence, do nonviolence. Here's a disadvantage to using a violent approach. Here's a net benefit. Although given that I'm kind of tired and still a little warm, was not as smooth as I normally am in regards to delivering that example, but I think you got the point, right? That is an example of a counterplan, an alternative, another way of doing things, without using the label, without using the jargon, without using the vernacular that some people just go, that's policy, I don't like that. So my starting point is many of the arguments that are deemed progressive, number one, not only have been used for a long time, but kind of framed in a different way, but I think are not only applicable, but also provide some value-added things to Lincoln Douglas. And we can talk about what some of those things are if you so choose. But what questions did you all have? Yes?
Okay, so sticking with the example that you just gave,
Yep.
how you can sneak in a counterplan, it's not calling it a counterplan. So in our area, how our cases are set up is very strict. It's here's my value, here's my criteria. Contention 1, read review.
Yes.
So how would you put what you just said into that rigid structure? Would you put your value as nonviolence?
Well, the value could be, maybe it's the same thing. I mean, it could be justice, it could be a reduction of oppression, it could be, maybe that's more of a standard or a criteria, but maybe you agree with the value, in regards to change, if you want to call it that. The debate then is about the standard, the criteria, the method in which you do that. I would suggest two things. That would be contention one, violence is inconsistent with true political change. Insert all the reasons why violence is bad, right? And all the things I said, it intensifies.
So kind of almost like taking impact from the counterplan and making it into a contention.
Yeah, and the thing is just trying to think about the argument without the label.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's
Because
what,
if I walk into a coffee shop and I'm like, I want to talk about a counterplan, the idea of nonviolence, and people are like, what are you talking about? Right? But if I were to say a discussion about strategies toward political change and dealing with oppression, smart people would get that.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You get that. Then I would say contention two, my alternative is a nonviolent approach to dealing with political change. Everybody can agree political oppression is bad. Everyone can agree that state violence is bad. That should not be the focus of the debate. The focus of the debate should be about the method of how we resolve that in one way, shape, or form.
So if you're framing it in LD, instead of, I guess, like the actual action, you could frame it as, here's the negative impact that I would be going against with my counterplan kind of thing. And then the next one be, like, here's what we should be valuing or looking at as the positive, which would be your action that originally was the counterplan.
Yeah, no matter the format, you have to disprove some fundamental thesis of the affirmative if you're negative. I think that would be fair. You need to, if they have a thesis, you need to have some kind of antithesis. I mean, that's the nature of what argumentation and debate is. Once you clarify what that thesis is, I think it's legitimate for the negative to then say, here is my antithesis. And the value is just stopping political oppression, right? Or whatever you want that to be. You can't really disagree about that. The other thing I would say as it relates to counterplans is there are times where the affirmative is just right in regards to their harm area. For example, if you were to say that there a topic about last 2 or 3 years about whether victims of domestic violence ought to be able to use deadly force. I don't always talk about violent examples, by the way, but those two just kind of came out. Well, if the first part of the affirmative is about the incidence of domestic violence, about maybe even an example or two of the perpetuation of violence, the idea of how that transcends generations even from, if it's the stereotypical, male-female kind of situation, although there are a lot of men that are physically abused as well, but it's unreported. That's hard to disagree with. You can't say really and when domestic violence is good, right? Although I've heard kids do a variety of different things that are arguably worse than that. They lost with very low points. But you want to then talk about the method, right? So that is why I think anyone that says, well, alternatives bad, counterplans bad, other ways of looking at things bad, may put their students at a disadvantage, because there are many times areas in which we have to agree that the harm is a real thing. It is only a question of how to engage that harm. An example, we have examples about that in life all the time. Doctor says I need to lose 100 pounds. Well, I could go to some boot camp somewhere, probably wouldn't survive. I could take a bunch of different types of meds. I could have all kinds of adverse drug reactions. I have to look at competing methods to achieve a desired goal, if that makes sense to everyone. So, yes.
What could you address in terms of research and predictability? Like if you're unlimited and you are going to run into these kinds of arguments, you really don't know. Unless you're a policy failure.
I don't know what that means, know if you research. For example, if the topic is about, again, the domestic violence issue, you know as a result of research different approaches in dealing with domestic violence. One would be you ought to be able to use deadly force. One would be helplines. One would be other education, other resource centers. One would be restraining orders. Those are all things in the literature, it seems to me. And as you research, you know, A, what you have to defend on the affirmative, it seems to me, and B, what other people might say. So I do think it's pretty predictable in regards to what you have to defend yourself against from the other side. I mean, at least in my opinion.
So would you say like a beneficial thing to do when researching not only be like
You got to research both
the
sides.
harms, but also
Yeah.
extending into
Yeah.
argumentation for methods?
Yeah, because the harm is easy to prove in a variety of different areas,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if in the debate the other night, was that last night?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was last night. Okay. Again, long days. The harm to privacy, most people would think, is pretty important. And securing your identity, pretty important. Things along those lines. The debate could be about whether that's good or bad. The debate could be about whether there are ways to outweigh that. You could agree, yes, identity is important. Yes, privacy is important. Those things are not absolute, though, and we have to look at other factors as well. I'm glad you brought that up. I thought last night was a really good example, and the reason, again, I wanted to bring those two students together was the divergent style that they had. And his argument at the end of the day is, she's just talking about money. She says it's hard. I'm talking about rights. I'm talking about what makes us who we are. I'm talking about identity. And for a lot of people, I saw a lot of heads nodding, and you're kind of like you was in church. You're like, okay, all right. And I thought both did a fantastic job, but the two styles is many times what you see out there on the circuit. One who is arguably more progressive, and she made fantastic arguments as well. It just may have appealed to a different sense of persuasion and what you like, and the different styles. And that's a good example. And I tried to say this last night. He was making a lot of arguments without using debate jargon that had the exact same implication, right? He says you can't aggregate economic impacts, and there is no real impact associated with what you said, and here is a reason that the affirmative outweighs that. And that was just debate parlance for my advantage outweighs your disadvantage without using the language. He says there's not much of a link, and here's the reason why, and that is no link without using as much of the vernacular. So, yeah, I think it's easier to figure out or anticipate what people might say, because you have to encourage I don't think you can be a truly effective debater and construct an affirmative without knowing exactly what arguments the negative might make. One of the tips that I might give you is that two things. One, in thinking about writing an affirmative, start in thinking about the 2AR or the last speech first. Maybe that seems interesting. Why would you do that? Well, you kind of know what you want to talk about. To continue the example of the either political oppression, domestic violence, living wage, you choose the example. You know what harm area you want to talk about. If you're talking about the living wage topic, which we debated a lot in January, February, toward the spring of the year, you want to talk about people in poverty. You want to talk about, the people who are working in Walmart, places along those lines, who are working hard every day, but still not having enough money to make ends meet. You want to talk about, sweatshop workers in other countries and children that are working to make some of the garments that we all have on, to play not just to the head, but also to the heart in regards to persuasion. And I think that's particularly important. And many LDers have forgotten that these days. But I think in any persuasive appeal, it is about the head, it is about data, it is about logos, it is about, all those things, but it's also about the heart as well. If I were talking to you about what limited knowledge I have about interp, it would be the same thing, right? You have to tell people what you want them to think, you want to tell them what you want them to feel, you want to tell them, the process, associated with all those things, and, I'm talking too much. Another question?
Other than counterplan,
Thank you, sir.
is there any other
Thank you.
jargon
Absolutely.
that we should not use?
Not use may be strong, being wary of use, for me, may be better. I mean, think about any policy, and let's do it this way. Think about any policy argument, whatsoever. And those arguments, I feel, are all applicable in Lincoln Douglas. For example, no solvency. Plan, I'm going to show you how old I am now. Plan, meet, need. Plan, meet, advantage. Policy debaters don't even know what that is these days. That's sad, but they don't. I think it's easy for the negative to say the affirmative claims to address the harm associated with X. Here are a couple of reasons why they are unable to do that. First, second, third, fourth, or 15, well, maybe not that many. But first, second, third, would be very reasonable. They don't address the problem that they attempt to isolate. They don't solve the problem or minimize the problem that they attempt to isolate. Same argument, you're saying that there is no solvency to the act, but you're avoiding using that vernacular. Disadvantage would be the same thing. I think that's easier, because I think it's easy to say if truly you have an advocacy on the affirmative and you've chosen a method, if the negative can say, if I can win that there is some disadvantage to adopting the affirmative method, I should win the debate. And if it is truly utilitarianism, and it's truly about the greatest good for the greatest number, if I can win that there is more harm associated with voting affirmative than they solve, I should win the debate. Really what was said then is, I have a disadvantage or a disad which outweighs your affirmative, without using that parlance, right? Same thing true with topicality. Sometimes people are maybe strategic, some would argue sketchy in the way that they will interpret the resolution, right? More power to them. But if your student is like observation 1, topicality, A subpoint, interpretation, blah, 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 B subpoint, violation, C point, people will be like, no, right? They don't know what you're talking about. If the student says, the topic is about banning handguns, right? The affirmative seems to limit itself, I'm just making stuff up off the top of my head here. The affirmative seems to only want to ban handguns to one small group of individuals, and that doesn't seem to be what the resolution is talking about. The resolution seems to be a categorical ban on handguns. In fact, the resolution says, fill in the blank, prohibition of handguns of citizens, things along those lines. And here's the reason I think they haven't met their burden in regards to defending the topic. It's the affirmative job to defend the topic. I don't think they're debating about the topic. I think we came to debate about the topic. I think that's the reason they should lose. Okay. What have you done there? Same thing, right? Here's what I think the topic ought to be about. Here's what they did. Here's why I think they did avoid a real discussion about the issue that everybody thought we were here to debate about. And if you're not here to talk about the topic that we agreed on, when we signed up to come to the tournament or whatnot, I think the affirmative ought to lose. That seems to me to be a reasonable discussion as well. You can also use analogies of, school. If there is an English paper assigned and the teacher says, I want you to write, 5-paragraph essay about X, okay? Student comes in with a brilliant essay about Y. Are they going to pass? No. They shouldn't. Maybe there's a do-over, but student says, no, I really want to write about this. I feel it's important for me to speak about this. Okay, good for you. You're patriotic now. Yes, thank you very much. But same thing would apply. If there is some agreement, a about what we're supposed to be debating about, and if the affirmative steers too far away from what that ought to look like, although I do think the affirmative ought to have a lot of leeway as to what they get to talk about, the negative should get to contest that as well. PJ also talked about critiques a little bit as I, came in. Same thing is true in Lincoln Douglas. Everybody talks about rights in LD, increasingly less so now, but many of you may have heard of a concept called rights trivialization. I think the author is Marianne Glendon, but it's been a while, but rights trivialization. And it makes the argument that when we say everything is a right, then no real right has meaning, and if you think about in the U.S. what we see as a right, it very much even differs from the international perspective, even the UN Declaration of Human Rights, about what they might see as a right. Those things are distinct, if you've done any research about that. I believe the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think, is like a two-week paid vacation, that kind of thing. And normally we don't think about that. We think of that as a need very much. If you're a teacher, you want like a 2 months, paid vacation that's free, but, that's an example. I'm sorry? 4. Yeah, 4, like 5, more than that, if we're being real. But that is an example of an argument that could be made by the negative, is if the affirmative is playing liberties with, I think X ought to be a right. You could use a handgun example for that. But you say you need self-protection. You say that there is a right that you have to self-defense. I would even agree with that to some degree, but where does that end? Now you say you want a right to handguns. Do you have a right to semi-automatic weapons? Can you have, tactical nuclear weapons if you can afford them? Can you have grenades? There has to be some limits on what we say is a right, or rights truly in some way, shape, or form don't have meaning. That's not the best example, but that would be an example of where you could utilize a critique to challenge the nature of rights articulated by the affirmative. And many of the other critiques would work as well. Again, it's just a matter of how you choose to frame or package those arguments.
Now, is it true that, and I've heard people tell me this, that you can't technically, according to the rules, have a counterplan in LDs? That
there is no such rule.
There's no such rule. Okay, good to hear that. Okay.
No.
Okay.
No. And part of the question is, I don't think you have to say the word counterplan. I mean, if many affirmatives in Lincoln Douglas are now having a plan, and if the app says, here's my specific advocacy, here is my plan, I think the negative ought to get to say, here's my counterplan, here's my counter-advocacy. If you just say, my thesis is X, you ought to be able to say, my thesis is Y. And if anybody, the logic of why that would be a rule is unclear to me. Think back to the first example about violence as a just response to oppression. Arguably, the way I framed that could arguably be excluded, right? Because you could say, well, that's a counterplan, because you've argued another way of achieving that, and that's unfair. If you can't debate the antithesis of what the affirmative said, that seems to be a problem for me, right? You ought to be able to at least just say no. Kind of a Nancy Reagan approach to a debate. Yeah.
Can we just assume that since the app is affirming that guns ought to be banned, that their plan is to ban guns? That's their plan, even if they don't call it that?
Handguns, well, yes, but there are robust discussions going on over there as to whether or not there can be conditions placed on that, like ban guns for a particular subset of people, or, in an attempt to narrow it, or whether it's a more broad-based approach, a more holistic approach to it applying to everybody. Conversely, on the negative, some people are thinking about ways to ban certain individuals from having handguns, but allow other individuals to have handguns. So it questions and criticizes the nature of a prohibition, if you will, and whether that prohibition should be universal or whether it should be for, you know, a more limited group.
Christina, that might be a state rule, you think?
I don't know, but I've had people mention that to me.
I
that
think it's a
kind of-
rule at CFL.
Is that maybe where, that's right, I don't know, I've
That
heard
sounds
somebody
like
say
it
that
would be
before, and I'm
rules.
like.
Yeah, I mean, the
But
question,
I guess we could just frame it in a way.
the question for me as to what that is, I don't even know how you, having dealt with some protests in my life and so and whatnot, like every year, is how you enforce that. I mean, if I say counterplan, okay, I guess you could say gotcha, you know, but if I say, you know, we should use
Alternative plan.
nonviolence, well, yeah, or if I say nonviolence, you say violence, is that a counterplan? I mean, I don't really think it's defensible.
So really, they're just.
Well, and you really have to give them a plan.
Yes, well, and many times they don't have a plan. But the point is, can you then have, in the first example I gave, that's not a plan, but it is a way of thinking about things. It is a value statement. It is a way you want to approach the resolution. And I think the negative ought to be able to respond to that in some way, shape, or form.
Isn't it kind of stupid?
And that is.
Could you say that then using the resolution itself is the plan?
Yeah, absolutely. There's what's called a whole resolution approach to being affirmative, and what that means is I will defend on the affirmative the general statement that, you know, handguns should be banned, period. That's it. And then you could have advantages, arguments, etc., linked to a prohibition, you know, of that, right? You could also, as I said, perhaps choose a narrow subset in who and how you want to approach a prohibition. Because it doesn't say all people, it just says prohibit. So part of the argument that's being made and discussions are occurring, can you ban handguns to people who have felonies, for example? Can you, I mean, you know, if we deny people the right to vote, you have a felony, why do you get to have a handgun, you know, legally? Things along those lines. Yes?
In the debate last night, the app, when he read his case, he never specifically said like, okay, we're gonna definitely have it where we have to have the right to be forgotten. But when she got up in CX for neg, she said, so, okay, are you saying that if you win the debate, that this is going to go through and that the right to be forgotten is going to be established? And so then he had to admit yes. And so I guess if you wanted to do the counterplan thing, but they never specifically call it a plan, can't you just kind of get them to admit that in CX?
You could. He did that because he likes to debate a more traditional style that is kind of what I would call old school LD. I really like it, but old school LD, where it's value, there's a standard, there's some arguments that then link to the standard. You don't want to debate necessarily specific implementation. You know, one of the cases that my students ran on that topic was, well, there are a couple of them. One that was very interesting, we won't talk about that. But the other that we will talk about was a TTIP. It is a bit of legislation that is very specific, that tightens up U.S. regulations as it relates to the right to be forgotten, consistent with European regulations on privacy, because European regulations on privacy are far more stringent, apparently, than we have here. And there are really very good arguments about how we're not going to have trade with the EU, you know, on internet kinds of stuff, because they don't trust our lack of privacy, right? So there's going to be trade problems, there are going to be relations problems, things along those lines. So we chose a very narrow piece of legislation that we found quite a bit of evidence about that said the United States ought to do the TTIP. I forgot what exactly it stands for, but the bottom line it was we will agree to European standards as it relates to internet privacy. So the point is there are a couple ways. Hello, sir. There are a couple ways to affirm. One is kind of a broad-based, I support the resolution in a holistic way. The other way is to attempt to make it a little more narrow, be a narrow the discussion of the debate overall. And we heard several mention the living wage topic. Some people were specific, not only in regards to countries, right? And that was kind of hard to debate. If it's like, okay, somebody in the United States will give a living wage. Well, you could debate about that, because you could debate about which agent perhaps should do it. You could debate about, the process, and it is easier to debate the politics, maybe the efficacy, the research, on a domestic level. It became increasingly more difficult when students found an article on Mexico, on Thailand, on this country, on that country, and they would narrow their advocacy to one country. Not only one country, but also a specific industry in that one country. Not only a specific industry in that one country, but also a subset of individuals in the industry in the country. So what then became this, in regards to a topic, very quickly, expanded. Many of those were very successful in their approach, because it's one thing to debate about the United States implementation or consideration of a living wage. It's something very different if you're have to know about every country in the world, every industry in the world that are in those countries, every group of set of people that might can work in the industries in the country. You get the point.
So then would you argue that that was abusive because there's no way for you to prepare for all those countries? Or how would
It's
you handle
difficult.
that?
It's difficult because I do think there is an argument to be made about why that was problematic. I think there's probably a better argument that there is a pretty good literature base out there. I think there is a good argument to be made on the negative that you could defend an advantage or an example, if you will, to any individual country or individual industry, as long as you defended any disadvantage to the implementation of a living wage everywhere. But very few affirmatives wanted to do that. Why? Because that then meant many of the generic arguments that you had about living wage that might apply to the U.S. would apply to their proposal then, and they wanted to narrow it down so you didn't have, any real specific ground. There's one team in particular that did incredibly well this year. They had 2 or 3 students that were fantastic, and when debating us, they had a country not only of the week, but of the round. In round 3, it would be Mexico. In round, 5, it would be something else. And these are things they have prepared for us specifically, because typically my kids do a lot of research, and so we had kind of hunkered in on what they had originally, and then they just kind of moved to some other things to maybe run it just once or twice. I call them one-trick ponies. Sometimes you have to win a big debate, kind of like football. Sometimes you have to throw a Hail Mary or an end around, or whatever it is you want to do. This is a debate example, I think, of that.
See, as a judge, that bothers me because to me that's trying to get out of the argument, trying to get out of the clash and trying to have something that they can't argue against.
I think debate is about winning in the context of being ethical, and what I mean by that is you're going to choose an affirmative that is real hard to debate, right? And maybe it's more, some of the affirmatives we've had are fairly narrow, that's true, full disclosure. Some are the larger approaches to doing things, and you just kind of hammer it out in that way. It depends on the students, it depends on the judge pool. Sometimes many students have a diversity of cases that they use, but it's, you adapt your message to fit the audience, and if you have an audience that is accepting of those types of things, and you can do it, but you never know really what people think. It's kind of like in policy, where particularly like at NSDA, you have to figure out whether you think the judge is going to like your affirmative, right? Because sometimes people are hearing certain cases in a region. You may have something that you've run all year long that's just very different, and you have to figure out whether or not you think it'll cross over, if you will. And we spend quite a bit of time thinking about things like that. So, you know, it's just kind of a judgment call. I will say this. I found that NFL/NSDA, I'm so old, I still say NFL, I don't know about you all, but I'm working on it. NSDA, that many judges like specific clash. What I mean by that is, even if you run a case that's a little more narrow, that's a little different, that borderlines being what some people call a squirrel case, they are more accepting of that because they think it is the job of the negative to respond to whatever the affirmative said. You know, and we've run cases that are very, very small. We spend time trying to make them seem maybe of more significance than they are, but we then say, well, it's, you know, it's up to the negative to respond to what we said, and they're using these generic arguments and generic this ads, and here's the reason that that's bad. Here's the reason we have specific evidence to talk about our harm, our solution, etc. What else? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that, let's take NFL Nationals for example.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not voting on the name, I voted for it, but I said it was for sale.
I got you.
Anyway, do you think that progressive cases are more successful than traditional?
No. It depends upon what our definition of that is. It depends on whether it's policy or LD. In LD, the two people that have won the last 2 years are from Oklahoma, and they're both outstanding. The guy that you debated last night won this year, and he was second last year in NFL, NSDA. He lost 7-6 last year, so he spent the year trying to come back and get there, which is an incredible story in and of itself, because it's hard to qualify, it's hard to get through that. See, I think that any tournament, with any confined tournament, it really is 3 tournaments in one. What do you mean by that? At big tournaments, you have the preliminary rounds, and you got to get through the preliminary rounds, right? And there are different things that you have to do to get through multiple preliminary rounds. You then have the elimination rounds, wherever they start, and that's different, you know, because many times you have more than one judge, many times there may be a bit of an audience, many times the teams or individual students may be a little bit better, you know, increasingly, so that's different. I think finals, particularly big tournaments, is very different. Why? There's a little bit more pressure. Why? Many times there's more of an audience. The stakes are a little bit higher. So what I tell my students is, like in NSDA, it's 3 tournaments in one. We got to get through the prelims. Here's our approach to getting through the prelims. Got to get through as best we can, the randomness that is the judging in the, you know, and the whole event, but the elimination rounds and dealing with 3 judges as opposed to 2, because that's different, right, in the way that you engage that, and then the final round is totally different in the way you gear up, prepare, things like that if you have the opportunity to get there. But that's true for every tournament, right? I think people don't take final rounds as seriously at local tournaments as they once did. Now people want to leave. Now people want to, hey, we're co-champions. Now there's something about getting in and hammering it out and winning it. The judge saying it's 2-1 or 3-0 or whatever for you. You're having to deal with a little pressure. You're having to deal with, you're having to debate with, you know, sometimes adverse circumstances, you're tired. Right? Sometimes it's later at night, but in any championship, what I tell my kids is, in any championship you win, you're going to be tired. And sometimes it's a person who wants it a little bit more. So people are like at local tournaments, oh, well, you know, why don't we just go home early? It's like 6 o'clock, you know, so why don't we just leave and go home and we can be co-champions, and maybe it's not right, we want to win. I think that experience is important to create a mindset among students in not only how you prepare to win, but how you execute under pressure. Because it's one thing to do it in the prelim rounds, it's one thing to do it in practice rounds, it's one thing to do it when it matters. That's just me. Some people think I'm a little competitive, but be quiet. Yes, sir.
I'd say.
Aaron, since we were just having sort of a discussion about traditional versus progressive, again, I'm very new to this.
Yes,
and
sir.
I'm still trying to define those two. Can you sort of either define those two
Yes.
terms or at
Yes.
least characterize?
Last night is an example of traditional versus progressive. He took a very traditional approach. The delivery was, very moderate, I thought. The structure was very clear. He had traditional philosophers, Mill, I think, was his approach to doing things. And it was just traditional, here's a value, here's my criteria, here are my three contentions, here's how they all link back to the criteria and the value. And it's just a complete argument delivered at a reasonable pace that most people, particularly with, maybe a little fast, I guess, for somebody with no training, but with any debate training, I think most people think that was pretty slow, or at least moderate. She, on the other hand, debates in a more progressive style, being defined as making, because she was making arguments about, well, he doesn't solve the problem. She made arguments like, here's the EU disadvantage, A, B, C. And it infused a bunch of policy, parlance into what she was trying to do. There was a question about whether there was going to be a counter plan or not. I thought that was a little bit much given the nature of the audience. Kind of as a FYI, we're going to have another demo debate soon. We can get you the dates where there are two. There's one that's very progressive. It'll be pretty fast, kind of national circuit speed. There's another that's very slow, very traditional, so people could choose to go to either one. It'll be on the same night. I forget exactly when that is, but I'll tell Glenda, or it's listed on the schedule, I believe. But that's how we set up the next one. So the best definition I could give you is traditional would be kind of what Nikki did, the guy. Progressive is a little bit more of what she did. It is not just the type of argument, although I think that's a big part of it, but it is also the speed of delivery as well. She normally goes twice as fast as that, but only with people who are capable of handling that, right? Great debaters, I feel, are ones that can adapt to any audience, whether it's someone who's coached 20 or 30 years and they're used to the technique, they're used to the speed, they're used to the jargon and don't mind it, as well as people who are pretty new as well. As a coach, I like people to be honest about what they want. One of my biggest annoyances at NSDA is I don't think people are honest on the judge form. I think many do the best they can in regards to trying to answer the question, but let's say in regards to speed of delivery, right? And you put well, the speed of delivery in Montana as to what's an 8 is very different, to pick on Montana, from Texas, right? Particularly certain regions in Texas. There are certain regions in Texas where, the delivery is very slow. The delivery is very moderate. There are other regions of Texas where they're, fast policy speed, right? And if you say, I want this, I want you to go slow, I don't know you said really something. I want you to go slow, I want it to be value criteria, I want it to link back to a standard, I don't want, any real policy arguments, I'm not the judge for that. They can adapt to that, right? But if you say, tabula rasa, do whatever you want to do, and then you're like, lost, 18 speaker points, you talk fast. It doesn't seem very fair to the students in regards to being forthcoming about what you want, right? Parallel to an English teacher saying, either, here's kind of what I want in this essay, this is what I'm looking for, versus, just write something, whatever you choose, and then the kid writes something, and you're like, F. And they're like, but wait, you said write something, and, well, I just don't like it. That doesn't seem to give the students enough information in an activity where they're asked to adapt to do that. And I don't know if you've had to do this yet, but if you're pretty new, one thing I recommend is taking time when you're here, once you've kind of figured it out, to write down a judge paradigm, meaning a sheet that says what you like in debates and what you don't. Why is that important? One, it helps you to figure out, to compartmentalize some things you kind of like and some things you don't. But it's something that you could either put online. I can give you a wiki address where it's online, where kids can kind of look it up and they know. Or you could just hand it to them before the debate. Haven't judged you before, got a piece of paper, this is kind of what I'm looking for. They have one of two ways of dealing with that. They can be like, nah, I'm going to just do me. And you're like, lost 15. Right? But stupid judge, blah, blah, no. You're misdirecting the anger. The anger should be with yourself because you haven't really adapted at that point. But what I would say to you that it is important to be clear, to be honest, to tell them directly what you want. I very much respect people who are like, I want it this way. Because you can adapt to that if you're a coach, if you're a kid, whatever. But when it's like, if I'm being totally honest, if people go, I'm tabula rasa, you can do whatever you want to do, I don't want to judge you. Think about it this way. Would you marry somebody or date somebody who's like, whatever, I like everything? I don't know. That makes me awfully uncomfortable for a bunch of different reasons, right? Same thing would be true today.
I don't think anybody ever really is taboo.
You're absolutely not. We all have biases. It's a question of whether we know what they are. Because sometimes we don't know what they are, and there are trigger points, and you go, oh, I didn't like that, right? And then you can edit your philosophy, at that point, right? I think I'm very comfortable, and I like nonverbals from judges. Some judges feel that that's not okay. But think about it this way. In what other communication setting is there no feedback, right? You're listening to a speech, you're in church, or mosque, or whatever, synagogue, and you're like, you're in class, you're a teacher, and the kids are like, that's not really how it works. So, if you like something, it's like, so I can handle that. Or if you're like, I teach my kids, you gotta respond to that as well, right? If the judge is like, you gotta leave it alone. Okay, let me re-explain that for a moment. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about disclosure after the round? I don't disclose.
I think it is absolutely not only important, I think it is a good way to give immediate feedback to the student. All the evidence seems to indicate that students, if they're listening, we'll talk about that in a second, can respond to feedback if it's immediate. But if it's like in SDA, this really annoys me. People are like, it's a rule that you can't disclose any eliminations, and we will not talk about this. I'm like, it's not a thing. It is not a rule. I would prefer win or loss. Let's say we lose a quick 5 minutes from everybody. I thought your standard was better because blah, blah, blah. I thought you lost this argument. You can then move on. Let's say you win. I thought you did this well. I thought you did this well. You need a little bit of work on this, right? That then helps that